Okay. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Learning Course. Super excited to see those of you who have joined us in person, and for those of you who are watching this recording after the fact, we miss you. We hope you can join us live next time. Today we are diving into the topic of what is the beloved community with a special guest, Ainka Jackson. Ainka is an incredible Telos partner, someone who's incredibly influential on our ReStory US trips, and also is just a wonderful thought partner and community organizer. She's the founding executive director of the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation, which is committed to bridging divides and building the beloved community. She's also a teacher, a public defender, an author, and a community organizer. Incredibly talented, does so much in Selma and kind of for folks across the country. And she's received the first annual In Peace and Freedom Award in 2016 and is a level 3 certified Kingian nonviolence conflict reconciliation trainer, She's also the co-creator of the Beyond Divide and Conquer, Unite and Build Racial Equity training, which explores how the social construct of race was created to divide and conquer, especially poor whites and people of color. So Ainka, we could have invited you here to share so much with us about so many different topics. And I'm so grateful that you've taken the time today to come join us and help us unpack beloved community, what it is and why it's important. So welcome.
I'm so excited to be here with you all about this this goal, this cause that that is my life's work.
Awesome. Before I dive in and ask you some specific questions, I wanted to offer a couple of thoughts on why Telos has invited you, or why you're such an important thought partner for Telos. Our sixth principle of peacemaking is mutual flourishing. The end goal, or Telos, is beloved community. And I'm going to read the definition and then also drop it in the chat, because I think this is an important one to keep coming back to, in part because this will frame the rest of our work together in the Learning Core. This is our Telos. This is why we're here. This is what we're trying to do together. So let me just find the chat really quickly. Awesome. And I'll go ahead and read it for those who are joining later and can't see the chat. But our Telos is not the defeat of enemies, but the personal and systemic transformation that allows for mutual flourishing, reconciliation, and the creation of the beloved community. We form communities that in composition and practice model the world we strive towards. Joyous, intentional, reflective, action-oriented communities replace unjust systems with just peace. And as Mother Teresa said, we belong to each other. So I invite you to keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this conversation today. I'll start by asking Ainka some questions and having her share about her work, and then we'll have some time for questions from you all. So as Ainka is speaking, if there's anything you want to ask, feel free to drop it in the chat now or ask it later. I'll invite you all to unmute and ask it yourselves live. So Ainka, to start, you're a co-creator, executive director of the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation, and you all focus your work towards building the beloved community. Why is that concept the framing idea you all chose to guide the vision of your work?
I think that it's because that was always the goal of the civil rights movement. I think that often we think voting rights, we think particular battles that were within the civil rights movement, but that was always the goal. And our very first board meeting, one of our co-founders and our board chair, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who was a leader in the Nashville sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, the Selma movement, and who Dr. King appointed to be over the Poor People's Campaign, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, he said, there's unfinished business of the civil rights movement, and we need a Selma 2. So our charge is Selma 2.0, finishing the unfinished business of bridging divides and building the beloved community. And so we see the beloved community as the goal that always was. This is the goal that King talked about. And so it's not a new goal. We just feel like we are continuing the goal that was set by our forefathers and foremothers.
You answered my next question, which was going to be to have you talk a little bit about where this concept comes from. Is there anything else you want to say about Reverend Dr. King and his contribution to this vision?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So what we know of is that Josiah Royce, and this is really fascinating because my son's name is Josiah, was the first person that we know of to name Beloved Community, who founded the Fellowship of Reconciliation. But Dr. King really is famous for getting it out there and giving us more context for what Beloved Community is. And Dr. King in 1956, after the Montgomery boycott, and after a favorable decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, said this quote, and I think this is very important. So he said, "The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is the type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding and goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men." And so I think that Dr. King knew that this was the goal. And so we have just taken up that mantle and moved forward. And we see it very much so. So in our work, we address violence in its many forms, primarily racial, physical, and economic violence. And often people don't see those things relating to, beloved community. But in this quote that Dr. King said in a speech in 1957 called Birth of a New Nation, he said, "The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community. The aftermath of nonviolence is redemption. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation. But the aftermath of violence is emptiness and bitterness." And we know in this world, we have a lot of emptiness. We have a lot of bitterness. And there has to be another way. And so we believe that beloved community is, in fact, that other way, that we have to build the, but we can't build the beloved community without being the beloved community. And I think that is probably the major challenge that we have to why we don't have beloved community, because we think it's just something we can do versus it's something that we actually have to be. Yeah.
There's so many great things you just shared in there. I really like the joy that comes through in that too, that this isn't just about looking at the violence of the past and trying to change that for a better future, but it's doing it and building, at Telos we would say, action-oriented, joyous communities. I think there's a lot of that came through in what you just shared. One of the things I'm hearing in what you're saying and in some of the reading I've done about beloved community too, is it's kind of that both and of interpersonal relationships, but then also societal and systemic transformation. Can you share a little bit more? You mentioned that the work you all are doing is Selma 2.0, continuing the movement, continuing the work that was started in the civil rights movement. Can you share a little bit more about what that looks like concretely in terms of your work in Selma, especially addressing some of that systemic violence or the need for systemic justice that we might not see if we only focus on interpersonal relationships?
So one, I'll say, we often say systemic when we really mean institutional, but racism operates on a personal, cultural, and institutional level, and so therefore it's systemic. And if it operates on all those levels, our solutions have to as well. And so we get caught up by only wanting to do the institutional. But if we don't do the personal and the interpersonal, we're not going to affect the institutional, because what makes up the institutions are people, right? People make the laws. And so the what we believe, which are the culture, is the culture piece, it makes up policies. And so if we don't change the people and the culture, we won't change the institutions. It's a both and. Part of our theory of change says there has to be heart and mind change. Action with hearts and minds, which is like which is like narrative change. We consider that changing the false narrative of the hierarchy of human value, that some are valued more than others, and racial healing and relationship building. And then material conditions work, law, economy, and separations. That's like social separation, segregation in schools, housing, so on and so forth, that we need all of that together. And that's the transformation sweet spot. And that you have to do all of that on a personal, cultural, and institutional level. And so I'll say a couple of things, but I do want to start with the personal, because I think so often we want to skip to the institutional, but so much harm is done because we don't do the personal. Like, for example, and I said before, you can't build the beloved community without being it. It is not just a destination, it's a journey. But this morning, when my son called me, when he knew I was getting ready for this and I was trying to prepare, and I did not, I reacted poorly. I was not being the beloved community at that point, right? Like, so you can't build it if you can't be it. Last night when I came in exhausted, and the few things that I asked my children to do, like cutting off lights, locking doors, just very simple, basic things. But I didn't say, how was your day, right? I was not being the beloved community. And if we're not doing that kind of introspection to check our own behavior and how we're treating people around us, and that's from family to neighbors that we do not know, right? Then we can't build the beloved community. Dr. King said, our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as quantitative in our lives. And so we have to do the personal work as well as the institutional work. As in terms of that institutional work, which it also is so critical. I just don't want us to ever skip over the personal work, because it's so much easier to point to other people. But the first principle, the first racial equity principle, is to know thyself. And when we don't do our work, we make others work more. And quite frankly, many of us are tired of working more. So we all have to do our work. So doing that daily practice of work, and for me, that, the principles and steps of nonviolence really speak of this. Principle 5 and step 3 really talk about that personal stuff that you have to do to stay renewed in nonviolence, as well as to that helps you to get the clarity needed to stay doing this work. So you can make the institutional changes so that it is a systemic change. Some of the work that we do to help transform institutions, we sort of, to bridge divides and build the beloved community, have 4 major things that we do. We do trainings, and so that's racial equity, nonviolence, and restorative justice. We do, and we're so excited. Next week, we're having a nonviolence conflict reconciliation training with Dr. Bernard Lafayette leading, which is always so amazing. Whenever I think I could check out for a moment because I've heard a story before, it's like, no, I learned so much. I get another nugget. Sitting at his feet is such an amazing sight to behold. And so we do trainings. We do community organizing and revival. So we're working on establishing beloved community block clubs. And that's really to help our community but better understand what we once knew, that we're better together, right? And that there are benefits to working together, that quite frankly, that individualism has helped us to miss the mark on. And so having to incentivize again, to help us to know that working together, we can go further. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And so we have a long way to go, so we really have to go together so we can go far. And so we have also have a violence intervention program. Selma in 2014, we were the poorest county in our state, and Selma is the county seat. And in 2015, we were the most dangerous place to live in Alabama. In 2016, we were the 8th most dangerous place per capita in the country. It's insane. It's really insane. We believe that broken relationships have led to broken economies, leading to broken communities, all in need of healing, not in need of fixing, but in need of healing. And so we partner with communities to heal relationships, to heal communities, and to heal the economy. And so our violence intervention program has street outreach workers, which are trusted community members who have lived experience, that are violence interrupters, that connect people with employment, those who are most likely to shoot or be shot, and connects them with employment and educational opportunities. The program is rooted in nonviolence, which makes it a little different, significantly different than some of the other violence interrupter programs around the country. And we thought that, given Selma's history, that was befitting, but also because we knew that we wanted to make a cultural shift, and nonviolence gets at the culture of violence, and that was really important to us. It has a victim survivor services component as well, because if I don't have basic needs met, like, I'm struggling to pay for a funeral, or don't have victim compensation because the breadwinner was killed, I'm going to be angry, or I'm more likely to retaliate. And so that victim services component is so critical. So there's other work of the center, but I'll stop there for now. But all of those things really are so interconnected with building this beloved community that we are seeking to be and build.
Thanks, Ainka. For the rest of you on the call, if you've got follow-up questions on any of the programs, all of the ones she's mentioned are truly extraordinary, and I think a model for what other communities across the US can and should be doing. So in a little while, if you've got anything else, any follow-up questions, feel free to explore those further too. Ainka mentioned the training.
Can I say something about that model?
Yeah,
that is actually our goal, right? Our goal is to be a model of the beloved community, so that when people come to Selma, they're not just coming for our history, they're coming for our healing. And they can learn these models, and they can take them back to their communities and adapt them for their communities. And they can say, how did you go from the 8th most dangerous place per capita in the country to this? How did you go from all of these failing schools to this? How did you go from having all these siloed and fractured relationships to this? And then they could take them back to the communities. That's how we believe that Selma will change the world again, and that it won't be undone by the entity like the Supreme Court, because we really will be changing hearts and minds and material conditions.
absolutely. I also want to plug the trainings, right? I've gotten to do one training online with you, and then a couple things in person with you. And so I'll share some follow-up information for everyone else about the Selma Center trainings, because they really are a great place to do a combination of that personal transformation and then also point towards the community action organizing. So if you've got a chance, I don't know, Ainka, if you're still doing them online or if you've shifted more to in-person after COVID, but highly recommend.
Coming up, we have next month, we have Racial Equity 1.0 that's virtual. We have a Racial Equity 2.0, which is a longer training in April, that's longer, that is virtual. And in July, we're actually doing a racial equity training of the trainers. So if you have gone through our trainings and want to become a trainer, one of our trainers, to do trainings all over the country, perhaps different parts of the world, that you can come to our in-person racial equity training. So that is virtual. As a part of that, we do have nonviolence as a part of each of those trainings. Right now, we don't have a nonviolence scheduled virtually, We only right now have our nonviolence that are all to just completely nonviolence, not paired with racial equity in person. We have a nonviolence on the last week in June with Dr. Lafayette again, the last week in June as well. So please do check us out on Facebook and our website to get those dates as well.
Absolutely. One of the things I wanted to bring in too that you had mentioned, because you covered so much in that last piece that was so helpful, was Telos also has the practice of self-interrogation and advocation, or self-interrogate and advocate. Advocation's not a word. And I want to bring that in part for my next question, because I think that really for us too gets at the idea of the place we have the most opportunity starts with us and our communities and those where we have a relationship and love and trust built. But for me, self-interrogation also covers that room and like brings in some grace of we're not all going to get it right the first time. There's a lot of learning as we put this into practice. And I'm wondering if you can share, because you've been doing this in Selma in your community for so long, what some of the misconceptions you've encountered about beloved community are, or some of the things that folks do with good intentions, but think they're building the beloved community, but might actually be counterproductive to some of the work you're trying to do there.
So one thing I would say is people move to act too quickly. I think, or they stay in their heads and don't act at all. It's either one of the extremes oftentimes, right? And I think it's because it's fear that drives you. Us, not it's me too. When we allow fear to drive us, it either stops us from moving or gets us to move too quickly. And so if we allow love to guide us instead of fear, it dramatically shifts what happens. I believe you can do the same action, and if it's rooted in love, your fruit will be different. But if it's rooted in fear, your fruit is going to be different. And so it's so important that you're rooted in love in doing this work. So I tell people, you're going to get it wrong. It's okay. Take ownership of it, apologize for it, do better next time. But if you allow the fear of messing up stop you from doing anything, you won't do anything. And while you're sitting in fear, people are being harmed. And so that's not acceptable. It's also not acceptable to move so fast that you're harming people because you haven't done the work. And I find that happens a lot, right? That particularly in progressive spaces, people move really fast because they think it's other people that are the problem and not doing the internal work and do harm. And so it's really, really important that we are all, because we all have fallen short. And so we all have to do our work. Nobody is exempt. It doesn't matter your race. Nobody is exempt from doing our work. And so that's so important. On my first trip to the Holy Land with Telos and Amplify Peace, excuse me, you all, it was life-changing for me. And I wrote a blog called Let There Be Peace. And the end of that phrase is, and let it begin with me. Because I didn't realize how judgmental I still was. How self-righteous I still was, how I was letting fear control and dictate my life so much. Like if someone asked me if I was a fearful person, I would have told them no, because I didn't feel like I was. But when I quieted my mind, when I had less distractions, I realized how much all of that stuff was going on in my head. And so now I have a much more rich meditative practice where I can hear my thoughts and be aware and be mindful. And I'm more mindful of not doing damage to others and doing damage to myself because of that. And so it's so important that we are doing that work. So I not moving too fast, but not moving too slow. Being willing to knowing that you're going to make mistakes and knowing that that's okay. The other thing I would say about beloved community, a common one, is that this is about reconciliation. Reconciliation is required in beloved community, right? Reconciliation is the final step of nonviolence. But in some communities, people think reconciliation is just, can't we all just get along? And that is not what it is. It requires justice. It requires justice. And so it's not just touchy-feely. Nothing against touchy-feely. I am a touchy-feely person. But it is not just touchy-feely. It requires justice. Our in nonviolence, our definition of reconciliation is the mandatory closing step that you jointly celebrate and implement changes. And so that change is justice, right? But it also requires forgiveness, because I'm not going to be celebrating with you if I hate you, right? So that's important. But forgiveness is not exoneration. That there's still accountability, which I think is another misconception about beloved community, right? It's a misconception about love, because love is at the core of beloved community. And love is at the corner, it's central to beloved community, beloved, and unity is at the center of community, right? And love, again, is not just touchy-feely. Love touchy-feely, but it's not just touchy-feely. I like to describe love as compassionate accountability. And that's helpful for me not to go to either extreme. There is accountability, but there's also compassion. And so that has been helpful in grounding me, so I don't go to either extreme, but I make space for both, that multiple things can be true at once. And so with reconciliation, there is forgiveness and there is accountability.
Taking copious notes as you're sharing. There's so much wonderful truth that you are sharing. That's not just theory, but is practice. And I think gives some really concrete things we can all be doing personally and then externally to try and build the beloved community. One of the phrases that came to mind as you were sharing all of that is that peacemaking is internal and external, both simultaneously together, that each only works separately if they work together. So everything you're saying is really resonating with what I hope this community, this learning core, can be as well, where we're doing this work as a community. There's room for us to fall short individually and together. We're doing the personal work and we're holding ourselves accountable to trying to do some of the external, the work in our communities and institutions as well. Before I open up the floor for questions, so please, y'all, get your questions ready. Ainka, I just want to ask, are there any stories you want to share that really give an example of a beloved community as praxis? It's not just a theory, it's also a practice. You've talked a lot or a little bit about why it's so important that beloved community is what we're doing as we're striving for it. What does that look like in practice in Selma? And can you give us some examples of where that's been really successful so we can think about how we can model that in our own lives?
Yes, so I'll start by saying we pull our definition of beloved community from Principle 2. Principle 2 is beloved community is the framework for the future. And it says the nonviolent concept is an overall effort to achieve and reconcile world by raising the level of relationships to a height, raising the level of relationships among people to a height where justice prevails and persons can attain their full human potential. And there's some really key pieces to that, right? An overall effort, meaning that it's not just a destination, as I said before. This is a continuous thing, a continuous being. But it raises level relationships to a height. And so, so often in nonprofit worlds, we're concerned with justice outside, but we do a lot of harm with justice internally. We're so busy doing that we forget about the being. It is, I've said principle 5, for example, is that I will avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external violence as well as external physical violence. And I've used the example of exhaustion. And this is the biggest way that I do internal violence to myself. And I'm actually just coming out after this tornado in Selma that displaced a third of our population nearly. I was already tired, but adding on more work in a crisis, I went to unbelievably exhausted phase, and more stuff happened, more exhausting. And I started slipping into depression. And I usually can catch it before then, but I was really, really struggling until a couple of days ago, and I had stopped exercising. Again, I was doing internal violence to myself. I'm sorry for clapping. Internal violence to myself. And not to this same degree, but once before I was exhausted. I was on this spectrum before, and one of my colleagues said that I raised my voice at them. And not trying to make an excuse for my behavior, but when I was doing introspection to see what happened, what led to this, what could be done differently, part of what I realized is that I was exhausted. And my defenses were down, and I didn't have the energy that it takes, because it takes a lot of energy to be the beloved community, right? Right. And so I always thought that, that I was taking one for the team. Most that would happen is maybe I would die early. And so if I did this internal violence with myself, my kids may suffer for it, and down the road, but it's okay, because it's for the work, right? It's for the community. But I realized that I was doing violence right now, not just to me, but to others. And that's not acceptable, right? First of all, it's not acceptable to do that to my kids either, but it's also not acceptable in any way. And so it really is important on all these different levels that we're working and examining and seeing what we're doing and not doing, what we need to do better. So those relationships are key. So that's an example where harm was done because we weren't. I want to give an example of these relationships where differences were present, and because the relationships were heightened, that something beautiful happened. And so we used to have chat and choose before the pandemic at a local coffee shop. And it was a safer, braver space where we could build relationships and talk about really tough conversations and issues. And a white evangelical Trump supporter who has, even though we are both Christians, we have very different, we live out our faith very differently. She faithfully came to our chat and choose, and we both decided to lean in conflict with love, and we learned and grew so much from each other. And so I'll give two examples of what I learned from her. Is that she said the problem with Black and white people is that we give grace and mercy to those we love and are in relationship with. And she went on to explain how that is even extended in politically giving grace to people that you don't even know, but you're in relationship with them politically, and you give grace to them, right? And it opened up my mind so much that I wouldn't have learned if I would have discarded her, because we have different beliefs, right? One thing she learned from me, because we stayed in relationship with each other before she moved, was that she always talked about the problem is fathers aren't in the home, fathers aren't in the home, fathers aren't in home. And I was able to help her to see all of the institutional blockages, the systemic blockages for fathers being in a home. And if fathers being in a home was really her concern, these are all the things that need to be done to help fathers be back in the home. And if we weren't in relationship with each other because we don't agree on some major important things, right? Then we couldn't have opened each other's eyes to some very significant things. And so that those kind of things, raising those relationships up, right, allows where justice can then prevail. It changes the way people think, which can change the way people vote, which can change the way people can fulfill their full human potential, right? But if you don't do that, if we decide I'm gonna unfriend people because I don't like what they posted on Facebook, I can't be friends with them. I don't know them. If you are the one who has a relationship with them, how does that leave those of us that don't have a connection with them out there if you refuse to be in relationship with them? Now, I'm not telling people not to have boundaries, not to take care of your well-being. I am saying, though, when we think about the spectrum of allies, what we have recalled the spectrum of co-liberators, because we believe there's something beyond allyship, because there's a cost of racism to all of us, and so it's in all of our benefit to do this work. That you are next in proximity, and so you can help move that person over in a way that I don't have access to. And so it's so important that we don't become so self-righteous that we become unable to do what we have the privilege and the capability to do.
Thank you for sharing that story. For me, that really highlights one of our other principles of peacemaking, that authentic relationships, not just relationships, but authentic relationships across lines of difference fuels transformation. And that starts with listening to understand and holding perspectives in tension. And as you were sharing that, I thought back to what you had said earlier today about how it's rooted in love as well. That there's room for love across those lines of differences, even before there is understanding or alignment in terms of actions and maybe even shared values. And how important that is to forming authentic relationships, is having them being rooted in that love and deeper desire for building a future of mutual flourishing and connection, and not just transactional to try and change someone's mind or get them to your side. And that goes in both directions. So thank you for sharing that story.
Can I share this quote before you ask the next question?
Absolutely.
This comes from this book, Healing Resistance, which is by an amazing nonviolence practitioner. It says, conflict is the spirit of the relationship asking itself. It is through conflict that relationships are strengthened and we begin to see each other in our authenticity. When handled right, conflict is a sacred gift. That quote has been so incredibly helpful for me because I hate conflict. And for most of my life, I have run from conflict. And you may be thinking, a lawyer that hates conflict and runs from conflict? Why did you become a lawyer? Longer story for another day. But I have run from conflict, and I practice what we call in the nonviolence world negative peace. And we call it nonviolence with a hyphen. It removes the violence, but it doesn't add justice. So nonviolence, one word, adds justice. It resists the status quo. It is we call that positive peace. And so that, reminding myself, even on my last trip to the Holy Land in November with Telos, I got positive peace tattooed on my wrist to remind myself that that's what I'm supposed to be doing each day, that I'm supposed to be leaning into conflict with love, because it's so easy to just check out. It's easy to do what the 8 Alabama clergymen did, and they were well intended. I'm sure of it, right? I read an article about the fallout with them and their families afterwards, that they suffered for what they did, and they were trying to do something good. They were just trying to keep the peace, trying to keep things calm down, but they weren't trying to add justice. And ultimately, that is what we want. King said, rioting is the language of the unheard. And so the solution isn't to stop people from rioting alone, right? No, we don't want people to riot, right? But the solution is to hear them, right? If they're rioting because they're not being heard, the solution is to hear them and address the issues, and rioting will stop. Now, that doesn't mean you don't try to make sure people are safe, right? Sometimes you have to do things to make sure people are safe in the moment. But it's not just about that, because long term, people want to be safe every day, right? And that's why people are often angry and upset. And so that quote grounds me to lean into conflict with love and not just take the easy way out with negative peace. Just let's just keep the peace. No, we are going to lean into conflict with love.
I love that. And for those of you who've also heard Ainka drop so many great books and ideas, I'll go back through and pull some of those out and include them in the follow-up email. Because there's a lot that I want to dive into that you've foregrounded for us today. For our last 15 minutes together, I want to open up the floor to the rest of you who I'm sure have questions, comments, thoughts for Ainka. So we're a small enough group that please just feel free to unmute yourself. Micah, continue so you're on the recording if you're comfortable with that, and we can open up this conversation to your questions, and also, if you've got thoughts about how to use this in your community. This is a great chance to use Ainka as a resource, who is a font of wisdom for how we can start to do this together.
So I have a question. This is really amazing. And one of my questions is, how do you keep leaning towards love intentionally for yourself? And how do your groups call each other to accountability to make sure that you go slow enough and lead with love? Because, yeah, leave it at that.
So explain the last part of the question for me again.
Well, so you've talked a lot about making decisions based in love and leading towards love. And it's like, what does one that look like? And how do you, because most of us don't think very much about our intentions, or most of us aren't intentional, much less know what love is. So how do you keep a group in that zone, much less yourself?
So sometimes the group keeps,
and you're not going to.
Sometimes the group keeps me in that zone. So we were in staff meeting yesterday, and a problem came up with some of our people being kicked out of hotels from the tornado. And I went into panic mode. And I was like, I was about to freak out, and the staff saw it. And they were like, no, you're not going to freak out. It is okay. We will work through this. Take a breath. And I took a breath. Breath, so powerful. It is so centering. I'm also a person of faith, and so it helps me spiritually as well. And so doing that, I was able to stop reacting out of fear, so I could respond out of love. It shifted everything, and we came up with a plan. Literally, that one thing, them saying no, stop, shifted everything. And so this morning, I was working on the plan, right? And they were calling people in the meeting, getting the information, because the first step of nonviolence is gathering information, right? So we were able to do that immediately, but we had to stop first from freaking out, so we weren't operating out of fear. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, that was awesome.
Anyone else?
Hi, thank you so much. I hear from you this higher aspiration to living, which is live as if, the call to be the beloved community. And what I hear from that is self-accountability. And I really appreciate what you said. I just finished a book club on reparations. And so this has been something that our book club community has been wrestling with. And I wondered if your organization, if you touch on that, or if you, how do you wrestle, or do you wrestle with that issue of reparations?
So
in your organization.
So our organization as a whole does not wrestle with it. We live in a very southern state, where restorative justice, we were investigated for restorative justice being critical race theory, which has nothing to do with anything. So the thought of reparations, doing that work is just not something that works for where we are. What I will tell you is that we do work around repairing harm and making whole, which is at the center of reparations work. And so I think that a lot of our work lays groundwork for that, but we don't use that language because of where we are, quite frankly, the reality of where we are. But from our restorative justice work to our truth, racial healing, and transformation work, which I didn't talk about. So there are some philosophies around reparations that say, this is what we want and need for our communities and fund that versus other models. And if that model was chosen, that would be one of the ways that, that is the stuff that we are creating, right? We are creating these different models, right, that could be funded in that kind of way. But it is not in the Deep South. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people in the Deep South that aren't working on reparations, because there are. But for the way we have chosen how to move and bring people in, it would alienate those that we are trying to help move with us. And we did have one public conversation about reparations after viewing a documentary on we had this, what is it called, a Know Your Roots campaign, not campaign, but project, where we trace people's roots. It was Black and white people. That's largely what our city is almost entirely made up of. And we went through this together and traced our roots and did genealogies and did DNA tests and things of that nature. And we read a book together about, and watched a documentary about a person whose family owned enslaved people, and we talked about it as a part of that, and it was a tough conversation, but much better than I expected, given Selma, Alabama, quite honestly. And so that's sort of where we are with that.
Thank you for that sensibility. I'm in New York City, so it's very different. So thank you. That is wisdom that I need to be aware of spacing and place.
Thanks for your question, Sharon.
This
Anyone
is just,
else in our last? Oh, sorry, Lynn, go ahead.
this is really a super basic question and more just me being curious. What kind of engagement and participation do you have from the local white community in your trainings? And I mean, I have a daughter that was living in Montgomery for a couple of years, and so we visited her and came to Selma, and I wasn't aware of your organization at the time, which, but I would love to be back.
Yes, come
I mean,
back.
yeah, what kind of engagement do you get from the white community? I got the feeling that Selma is unbelievably segregated, so I'd love just to hear about that a little bit.
So Selma is still unbelievably segregated. We still have an all-white country club, literally. Dr. Lafayette has gone there twice. He loves golf, and they were afraid to even sell him a hat because it is that segregated. And so we are still very segregated. When we first started, let me just give this one piece of background information. During the voting rights movement here, there were more white people known to be killed than Black people. And it sent a very clear message to stay in your place. And people have largely done that, even if they didn't know the history, right? culturally you knew to stay in your place, Black and white. And so people were waiting. There were some people who were waiting for something else. They felt like there were two extremes out there. I would not characterize one set that people called an extreme. I wouldn't characterize it as an extreme. You all probably wouldn't. But for the Deep South, it was viewed as an extreme. And so they were looking for something else different. And so we have been effective at pulling people in. For example, the person who has invited the most people to our racial equity has been a white evangelical locally, right? And it's not because we are soft in our racial equity training. It is because it is rooted in love, right? And love, again, is how I talked about it first. It's not fluffy love. It is love that is rooted in, that's love where there's justice, there's compassion, accountability. But we're very intentional with our training, and we created it knowing where we were, but also knowing the truth and not compromising the truth. Sarah's been through parts of it, so she knows we don't compromise the truth, and we don't compromise love. We hold both, and so we have been effective. And so when we started working more on material conditions, that was really helpful, right? Because then it helped with narratives instead of looking at Black people as dangerous. When we started doing our violence intervention work, people could better understand how we have internalized the violence that has been put upon us, right? And that people do violence and crime where they live, and we still live in very segregated places, right? And so, and the effects that poverty has on crime, because we had done that heart and mind work before, and have been very supportive in this material conditions work. And so, does that mean there's large swarms of white people? No. But we've had for those who were waiting for something else, we have had really good support with a good amount of local white people.
Got time for one more question, I think, before we need to wrap up for today. Oh, Buzz, you're muted if you're trying to talk.
You're right. Thanks. Ainka, thanks so much for coming. I'm all about Selma 2.0. We go. We rock. I'm up here in Northern Virginia, up around DC. I'm wondering, we heard about the tornado. You touched on it briefly, but how is Selma doing in terms of recovering from that devastation?
We're in crisis, quite honestly. We do not have enough housing. We didn't have enough affordable housing anyway, and we had threats of gentrification before. People were buying up houses and not to sell them to the people that live here currently. And so you have that. Then you have people being put out of hotels because people are stopping paying for the hotels, and people don't have places to go. And so we are in a serious crisis. And one of the things, whenever you see beloved community and a description of it, you talk about seeing no homelessness. Like, that's a sign of beloved community, no homelessness. And we have a serious threat of homelessness. And I don't mean just unhoused because your home was taken in a tornado. I mean, like, no place to go. And so I am deeply, deeply concerned, but I also think that this can be a rallying cry for the beloved community, for Selma, to people of goodwill, because that's what Dr. King said. Dr. King said when he came to Selma in '65, he said, people of goodwill come to Selma, right? And so I think this can be a rallying cry for people of goodwill. Invest in Selma, help Selma, because Selma has literally helped the world. And not just in 1965, in 1865 as well, because with the Battle of Selma, because Selma was just such a stronghold, to the Confederacy. When the Battle of Selma was over and the Union soldiers took Selma, because so much of the artillery and things, the Civil War was over literally within a week. So we have continuously helped this nation. And so I just plead with people to invest in Selma like Selma has invested in the world. And I think that because Selma has been such a stronghold for this nation, that with Selma 2.0, we can have America 2.0, and that these models can not just change Selma, but can change the world once again, and that we can have models of the beloved community throughout the nation and then throughout the world. And so I investing in Selma is investing in the world. So I hope that people will consider that as we seek to be a model of the beloved community.
I think that's a great note to end on, Ainka. And we've shared the donation link before, but we'll share it again after this. One of the things I've loved seeing in Selma's recovery efforts is that it really is also a model of collective community recovery, rather than individual people or organizations, right, asking for funds only for themselves. That this is like a Selma together, rebuilding stronger, doing the work, continuing the work that was going on before the tornado, right? That was a disruption, but this has been in the works for a lot longer. If you haven't been to Selma in person, I highly recommend. It's a fantastic community. If you need suggestions for restaurants or things to do, we spent our Telos staff retreat there last year, which was just an incredible couple of days with a really special community. So I highly recommend. It's a little bit out of the way if you live up north like I do, but go visit Ainka in person. I'm going to make a quick note about what's coming up next. So our next meeting is March 10th. We'll be diving into a little bit of mass incarceration. That won't be our theme for the rest of the year, but it is one that I think is important to bring in, especially with some of the guests that we're hoping to have that I'm not going to name yet because we're still trying to confirm. But for that meeting, if you haven't read Just Mercy yet, that's a book I encourage you to check out, even if you don't have time to read the whole thing. It gives a really great example of the power of getting proximate. And then if you're not a reader, or if you want a different take, watching the PBS documentary Slavery by Another Name is another way to just kind of dip your toe into the water, get some context for the conversations we'll be moving towards next. But for today, thank you so much, Ainka, for taking the time out of your incredibly important and ongoing work to come teach us. It really is a really valuable opportunity for us to learn from you, and to learn from you and all of the ways you model building the beloved community, and doing that with us here today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be.
Awesome. Okay, Mike, if you want to end the recording.